Hi, everybody. You're welcome to the Tech Talk Show. And if you're new to my channel, you're welcome as well. Today, we're going to be diving into the world of Docker container on Azure. And my guest on today's episode is Pascal Naber. So please sit back and let's have some good time learning Docker container on Azure. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Tech Talk Show with me, Kazeem. So today I've got Pascal with me on the show. Hi, Pascal, and welcome to the Tech Talk Show.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to your show.
So, Pascal, let's kick things off with an introduction. So, can you tell the viewers and listeners who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, my name is Pascal Naber. I'm living and working in the Netherlands. Um, Actually, today is my last day that I'm working for Xperit, a great company with many great colleagues. But from February 1st, I will be self-employed. So, so today was both a sad day and also a nice day because I'm um, having a brand new future for me with my own company. Um, so I'm helping out customers for the last couple of years to embrace the Azure cloud. Have done all kinds of projects for big enterprise customers, from cloud-related software development to architecture to provisioning Azure resources using infrastructure as code. And um, and one of my focus areas is uh, everything related to Docker, and Azure cloud. So mainly Kubernetes and everything that has to do with it. So yeah, that's my background.
Congratulations, Pascal, for starting your own new company. Now, I guess the best way to better understand containers is by trying to compare it to a VM. So, but let's start with definitions first. For those new to Docker, what is a Docker container and how is a Docker container different from a VM?
If you talk about a virtual machine, a VM, then the computer is virtualized. And if you're talking about a container, then the operating system is virtualized. So we are talking about Docker images. A Docker image is the blueprint of a Docker container. So a Docker container is the instance of a Docker image. And you can have as many instances as you like of a Docker image. And a Docker image is lightweight. It's a standalone and an executable package that includes all software that needs the application to run. If you take a look at virtual machines, those are really big. We are talking about gigabytes. And that results in a long startup time. So they are slow to start up. On the other side, if you take a look at containers, those are relatively small, only megabytes big. And that results in really fast startup times, only a couple of milliseconds. That makes it really nice to work with them. Containers share the host operating system kernel. And yeah, I think yeah, if one of the big advantages is that it solves the environment inconsistency. So that means most developers, they develop on their laptop and um, they deploy to a server. Doesn't matter if it is using a pipeline or manually. Um, in my experience, before I was using Docker containers, a lot of problems um, resulted in that. For example, different versions of the software that is running on between my laptop and the server. Permissions that were not correct, missing DLLs, missing frameworks, missing libraries. So it works on my machine. How many times haven't I told that to my team members? It works on my machine, on my laptop. I don't know why it's not working on the server. Since I'm using Docker containers, I have not said that anymore. It is, if a Docker container is working on my laptop, then it's always also working on a server. And of course, that server needs to run Docker. You can rely on the way Docker works and that your application is exactly working as as it should work.
My next question is, what are those moving parts, right, that makes up a Docker container? And also, what has Azure got to offer in all of this?
Okay, a Docker image is always based on a base image, and a Docker image consists of layers. So this is actually the first layer. Let's say that we have an Ubuntu image. That's the first layer. For example, that's another layer. Then we can install our application. That is, again, a different layer on top of it. Maybe we will add some configuration for the application, and that is another layer. You can describe your Docker container in something that is called a Docker file. The Docker file has instructions to create those layers. And the advantage of these layers is, in practice, when I deploy a Docker container, the Docker container needs to be pulled from a registry. So let's say that our Docker image consists of 7 layers, each of 50 MB. Then it needs to download 350 MB. When I change my application and deploy it again, it's only the top layer, so the 7th layer. So the next time when I deploy my application, Docker will notice that only my top layer is changed. The 6 first layers will be the same. He will see that the layers, the hash is the same. So he is only going to download the 7th layer. And that makes your deployment even faster. So it's very handy how they work, Docker containers. So it makes sure that you have faster delivery and more agility.
So, is there a real world demo that you can show us of how we use Docker container services on Azure?
Yes, and therefore I'm going to share my screen. So if we talk about Docker on Azure, there are a lot of services that Azure has to offer that runs Docker containers. We are not going to talk about all services because some services like Azure Batch, it's not commonly used. We are going to have a look at the most common services. And those services are Azure Container Instances, Web App for Container, Kubernetes with AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, and a new one which is in preview, and that is a container app, Azure Container App. I have 4 times the same application here, and what you are seeing is the same. The result is every time the same. That's because I'm hosting one of my Docker containers for the Dutch Azure Meetup. And in this case, we have an Azure Container Instances container running. This is the web app, but there's no difference, of course, because the result is every time the same. I've got an AKS cluster running on a domain name here. And this one is a new one with Azure Container Apps. So this is the result. So this is not interesting to see the result. So let's have a look at how we provision those services. And in the meantime, I'm going to tell you the advantages and disadvantages. So the first service that we are going to talk about is Azure Container Instances. Azure Container Instances is a serverless solution to run Docker containers in Azure. And serverless is one of those buzz terms. So what does that mean? That means that it is event-driven. It means that you pay for the usage. So as long as this container is running, I have to pay. I don't have to maintain any hardware. It is fully managed. So how do we provision a Docker container with Azure Container Instances. Well, I'm demoing it here using the Azure CLI because that's really readable. With the Azure CLI, easy container create and a bunch of parameters. And the most important one is which container image I'm going to deploy. So this is the way it works. This is very nice for small applications, scheduled work, workloads like bursts, but it also has some limitations. For example, I can run only one container instance at a time. So if I want to run multiple containers the same, I should run multiple Azure Container Instances. And they can't react with each other. So we don't have any high availability between them. If we want to deploy a new version of the application, we will have no zero downtime deployment. We can't scale out. We do get a public endpoint, as I showed you, because I could show the Docker container, the interface of it. Azure Container Instances can run both Linux and Windows containers. Although if you run Windows containers, it's a bit more expensive because of the license. So Azure Container Instances could be fine for your workload. If you want to have more functionality, then we are moving to a web app for container. And a web app, well, then we are not talking about a serverless solution anymore. So in this case, we are always paying for the hosting plan, no matter if I have one or multiple containers running. And the web app for container is based on the web app that we know for many years. So that means there is a lot of functionality on this. It can scale up, it can scale out, it has auto scaling based on all kinds of configurations. If you configure it well, you will have zero downtime deployment. You get an endpoint with SSL enabled on it. If you like, you can add authentication, you can configure an identity, you can configure custom domains, and a lot more. So it has a lot of functionality. Really nice for the more advanced applications instead of Azure Container Instances. But there are also consequences of the use of a web app for a container. The name is web app. It is meant for web applications. So that means that your Docker container can only be called from port 80 or port 443. And if you want to run a lot of containers, well, then maybe it's time to move to a container orchestrator, like Kubernetes. If you're running a couple of containers, a web app for container could be fine. So the next step would be Kubernetes. To provision Kubernetes, this is the command. So, and there are a lot more parameters that you can enable. There is a lot of functionality on this. It also has dependencies, like on a virtual network, on the logging of it with the workspace. It needs an IP address, probably, if you want to have public endpoint. So with Kubernetes, well, what is Kubernetes? Kubernetes is actually the de facto standard container orchestrator to run Docker containers. So if you want to run a lot of Docker containers, and with a lot, I mean, if you want thousands or more, or if you want to run something like a microservice architecture, where many containers are communicating with each other, then the power of a container orchestrator comes up. And you could use Azure Kubernetes Service, for example. And Kubernetes is a platform that manages a cluster of machines, worker nodes. If one of the worker nodes goes down, then the other worker nodes will pick up the work that should be run. So your Docker containers will run always. If one of the containers goes down, well, then Kubernetes makes sure that your container will restart again, maybe on a different worker node, maybe not. He decides. If your container is not healthy because it uses too much memory or something like that, Kubernetes makes sure that your container will restart automatically. So the high availability and the reliance of running applications is very high, and Kubernetes is designed for this. So this Kubernetes makes sure that you won't be called in the middle of the night that your application is down. That sounds all very good and nice, and it's very powerful, but you also have to do a lot. So you have to do everything. Yeah, you are responsible for the cluster. So there are virtual machines underneath it. You are responsible for this. Microsoft updates the virtual machines. That's one of the advantages of running Kubernetes in the cloud. Microsoft also manages the master nodes. The master nodes do are doing the management of the cluster. You don't even have to pay for the master nodes in the Azure cloud. So you're only paying for the virtual machines that you are using. So that's very nice, but you have a lot of responsibilities. And also, if you want to provision an application, here, this is the application that I'm running. Well, you have to make deployments, services, ingress. It doesn't make sense now to go in depth now, but to give you an idea of what needs to be done. There's really a lot of work. And besides this, if you want to have a certificate, which I have here in this cluster, you need to install a cert manager, for example. You need to install an ingress controller. You have to do a lot. And Kubernetes is a service where, that runs platform independent. It is portable. So Kubernetes is running on my laptop. It is running maybe in your private data center of your company. And all cloud providers are offering it. So also Azure, also Amazon, also Google. Kubernetes is actually an IaaS solution, infrastructure as a service. That means that you are responsible for the maintenance of the virtual machines. The next step is PaaS, platform as a service. That's much better than the cloud provider is responsible for the maintenance of the virtual machines. All cloud providers are moving to a PaaS solution for Kubernetes. So, because actually I just want to run Docker containers. And now I can run my Docker containers, but I also have to maintain my Kubernetes cluster. And that's a lot of work. Yeah, both Amazon and Google are already offering a solution to run Docker containers. Google with Cloud Run, Amazon with App Runner. And now Microsoft has announced on Ignite last year a specific service to run Docker containers as an orchestrator. And that is Azure Container Apps. So at this moment, it is in preview. I can't use the Azure CLI for now. You have to use Bicep. So this is the Bicep declaration of the container app itself. And we have the environment. So if we talk in Kubernetes terminology, then the container app is the pod. And the pod can contain one or multiple containers. And the kube environment is actually where the virtual network is configured on. So that means every container app that is installed in this kube environment, they can see each other. They can talk to each other. So what is container app? Well, Kubernetes is underneath Azure Container Apps, but you can't access Kubernetes. So this is a fully managed Kubernetes offering where you can't access Kubernetes. So Microsoft has created a developer application platform on it. It contains Envoy for ingress. It contains CADA for auto-scaling, and it contains Dapper for application platform services, like communicating with a queue or with a database. For now, yeah, that is the functionality. They are expanding it because it's not yet good enough for a real world scenario, but it is a really good start. It really looks nice. And yeah, and this is the way to go. This is where all the cloud providers are going. And yeah, to be honest, I hope that it is not the end station, because yeah, what we are seeing is that Kubernetes is open source, portable, and cloud independent. I don't have a vendor login. And now all the big vendors are creating their own application platform. So no matter which cloud you will use, you will have a vendor login. So let's see where this goes. But I'm sure that that this is the way to go. That's what I already was telling you, that I just want to run containers. I don't want to manage a cluster. And that is what Container Apps is offering. So if you take a look at Containers Apps itself, well, it's in preview, so you can't use it in production at this moment. But for example, some nice functionality that we are seeing. Oh, that's I've deployed this only once, but you can imagine that if I deploy this multiple times, then I can decide how much traffic goes to the first or the second installation. So now I'm only having one with 100% traffic that goes there. But if I deploy again, then I can decide that my traffic goes for 10% to the new one, and let's say 90% to the old one, to have a look if the new version is working correct, for blue, green deployments. So that is one of the functionalities, and actually Envoy is offering this. Yeah, so that is what Azure has to offer. And yeah, maybe I can add one service for now, and that is a service that is always needed, and that is Azure Container Registry. So if you're not used to use Docker containers, well, then you deploy your application from a pipeline probably to a server. And if you use Docker containers, that's not how it works anymore. You publish your Docker container to a registry, a Docker registry, and if you deploy, then the application pulls the container from the registry to where it should be run. And it doesn't matter if that is Azure Container Instances, a web app, or Kubernetes. They're all working the same. So you can't deploy a container directly to one of those services. You always need a registry, and there are two kinds of registries, public and private registries. And of course, if you are a company, you don't want to have all your workloads public available, so you will probably need a private registry. And that is what Azure is offering with Azure Container Registry. So there you push your images to, so the applications can pool the images. And besides Docker images, they can also contain Helm charts. Those are needed to deploy to Kubernetes, and bicep packages. So that is in a nutshell what Azure has to offer.
For people listening or watching this at a later time now, and they still don't know why they need to learn Docker on Azure. So can you please tell us, why is Docker container on Azure such a big deal, and why do we need to learn it?
Well, I think it has so many advantages that I like Docker containers, because they are fast, because they contain everything that is needed to run your application, so they are very reliable. And And that alone resulted that companies are embracing Docker for many years now already. That's also why I like Docker containers. I'm working with them, deploying them, using all kinds of services in Azure. And besides that, have many companies are doing this. Gartner predicted this, that 75% of the global organizations will run containerized applications in production. So that's a big deal, and yeah, that's why I like them.
Let's wrap up with resources and tips. What are some of those resources and tips that you would like to share that can help those trying to get started with Docker and Azure?
If you want to play with Docker, then it's handy to install Docker for desktop. Then you can at least play with Docker itself, but you can also enable a setting to install Kubernetes on your laptop with just a checkbox. If you want to get to know Kubernetes, I've posted a link in the chat. I'm not sure if everybody can read this. I will, but the link is https://aka.ms/learn Kubernetes. And then you will get to a 50-day step plan. And in those 50 days, you will learn Kubernetes step by step. It's really nice. And I think worth your time.
All right. Thank you very much, Pascal, for coming on the show today. Is there any last word you want to share before we say bye bye now?
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. Hopefully it's clear. If there are questions, please let me know on LinkedIn or Twitter. And if I can, I try to answer your questions.
All right. So here is where we're going to be drawing the curtain on today's episode of the Tech Talk. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you once again, Pascal, for being my guest on today's episode. So if you like this video, please do hit the like button and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. So on that note, it's a bye-bye now from myself and Pascal.